When I saw the title of this video, I was flabbergasted. Surely even the good detective here could not miss the evidence that disproves this case. This one is a no-brainer. Or is he well aware of the evidence, but like a good defense attorney, steers his audience away from it to focus on what he wants his audience to see? Let's have a chat. Hello and welcome. Thank you so much for joining me, and especially to my patrons and channel members. Wallace attempts here to show the Bible was not changed over time, or at least that's the implication from his title. This should be a no-brainer, as the Bible itself tells you it has changed over time. Mr. Wallace would be better off telling his audience why, despite the fact that it has, he thinks you can trust it anyway. Just look at Mark 16, verses 9 through 20 were very unlikely to have been in the original text, as this ending isn't in either the oldest manuscripts nor is it referenced by the earliest works that cite the Gospel of Mark. We can't be 100% certain that this was not the original text, as we don't have any of the original texts. But the fact that this is in some manuscripts and not others is proof positive that the text was changed. Most likely, this passage was added by a later scribe. This is the consensus of not only Bible scholars, but even commentaries and apologists agree that this was not the original text. It is so well attested that this portion was added later that the Bible itself warns the reader not to trust it, or at least not to build any doctrine on it, which is the same thing. A notable exception is Nicholas P. Lunn, the original ending of Mark, a new case for the authenticity of Mark 16, 9 through 20, 2014. The primary evidence against it being original is neither Codex Sinaiticus nor Codex Vaticanus, the two early witnesses to Mark ending at 16:8. Lunn proposes that Gnostic Christians in Alexandria were to blame for deleting the longer ending because they were uncomfortable with the bodily resurrection notion. But Lunn doesn't explain why they didn't remove all the other references to Jesus' resurrection in Mark, or why they left the much more extended and explicit appearance narratives in the other Gospels intact. According to Dr. Peter Head, University of Cambridge, if 16:9 to 20 was the original ending of Mark, why would Christians have removed it? For we know that from the 5th century onward, it became overwhelmingly accepted. The longer ending was canonized as being the Word of God, yet few Bible scholars today believe that it is original. Codex Sinaiticus was found by Count Tischendorf in 1859 at the monastery of St. Catherine on Mount Sinai. According to gotquestions.org, Codex Vaticanus was found in the Vatican Library. It is not known when it arrived at the Vatican, but it is included in a catalog listing in 1475, and it is dated to the middle of the 4th century. Vaticanus was first used as a source document by Erasmus in his work on the Textus Receptus. Because he viewed the text of Vaticanus to be erratic, he seldom followed it when it differed from other Greek texts. Whoever added this passage intended to deceive the reader into thinking that this was part of the story. Why, we can only speculate. Perhaps the scribe felt the original ending was too abrupt, with an angel saying that Jesus rose and the women at the tomb telling no one. How can anyone have this story when they told no one? Perhaps the scribe was trying to line up the story better with Luke's gospel by getting the message to the disciples, both by either an additional appearance to Mary Magdalene or having her have a change of heart. The text is unclear on this. She then tells the disciples, and Jesus appears to the other disciples a couple times. Regardless of the scribe's reasons, the motive was clearly to get the reader to believe that this was part of the original text, which was a lie. A lie that many have died for by the handling of poisonous snakes and getting bitten, as the text also claims that believers can't be harmed by poison. Since the text's claim of believers being immune to poison is demonstrably untrue, Bible scholars conclude an omniscient God that allegedly does not lie would not include such a lie in his infallible word. But if you claim that this passage was part of the original work, you not only have a gospel claiming a demonstrably untrue claim about believers, you still have a gospel that was changed over time, since the earliest manuscripts do not include this ending. Some early scribe would have to have omitted it, in which case you still have a changed gospel. If the passage was omitted by a scribe, again, it would likely be with the intent to deceive. It's easy to miss a letter or even a line when copying work, but it is more than half the chapter. How could anyone neglect half of the last chapter? I suppose it is possible that he could have died, and someone could have thought that the work was complete when it wasn't. But if that's the case, one would think that God would be smart enough not to take home the servant copying his word at a time that will result in the dispute of the content of his infallible word. On the other hand, this God wasn't smart enough to figure out that if you put a delicious-looking fruit in the middle of a garden with two intellectual toddlers, the toddlers are going to eat the fruit. Maybe that's the problem. Possibly I should stop picking on the Christian God as he is intellectually challenged. I'll make a deal with you, believers. If you admit that your God is defective, I'll stop pointing out how defective your God is. Deal? Let's see if Wallace will address the obvious change in the Bible that almost all Bible scholars agree was a change in his video on how the Bible hasn't changed. Shall we?
Do we think these have been changed over time? If someone changes their story over time, there's a good reason to believe they're not telling you the truth. How do we know that the narrative, the gospel narratives, haven't been changed over time? Even if they were written early. Well, you have some early account, but how do I know that the account I have in my Bible today wasn't changed from the point at which it was written? Let me give you an analogy, a parallel of this. Let's say I have some piece of evidence that I find at a crime scene, and 30 years later, I bring it into trial, and I say, hey, you know what? This is what we discovered at the crime scene, and this piece of evidence is directly attributable to my defendant. This proves the defendant was at the crime scene. Couldn't somebody say, well, wait a minute, how do I know that that was really there 30 years ago? For all I know, you included this in the list of evidences 10 years after the fact. Somebody went to the property room, pulled out a bag, put that piece of evidence in the bag, put it back in the property room, and now I've got a bad piece of evidence in the case that was never there at the crime scene. Couldn't something similar have happened to the narrative about Jesus?
It obviously did. Your bag of evidence there has two different versions of Mark's gospel. Only one can be the original text, although it's even possible that neither is. You don't have any of the original evidence. Not a scrap of original gospel text exists today. This would be like going to the evidence box and finding only pictures of the original evidence. Worse, one picture shows the murder weapon with blood on it and another shows it to be clean. Which is the original picture? Did someone clean off the weapon after the first picture and then take a second? Did someone put blood on the murder weapon after the first picture? Did someone alter the picture? All you have is two pictures, and you can't tell which one, if any, is accurate.
Or you've got some gospel that was written way back then. Well, maybe Jesus was much simpler back then. He was just a preaching rabbi, just somebody who's taught good moral truths. He never walked on water. He never rose from the grave. He wasn't born of a virgin. All of those details were added over the years until the simple story of Jesus of Nazareth became the miraculous story of the Christ of Christianity. How do I know that that story wasn't changed over time? Well, let's go back and talk about a principle we haven't yet discussed. It's one of those 10 principles we introduced earlier. It's called the chain of custody. Well, if we have a crime scene from 30 years ago, we could simply ask, well, was there a detective or an officer at the scene 30 years ago who maybe saw that piece of evidence and photographed it with a Polaroid camera? Maybe he wrote a supplemental report in which he described it being at the scene. Then he brings it to the crime lab. They write a report. Then they bring it back out to our property room. Then they write a report. Then I pick it up from the property room and I write a report. Well, now I've got image after image after image, report after report after report describing that piece of evidence over time, linking it from the past to the present. And each person who describes that piece of evidence is like a link in a chain. And that's why we call this the chain of custody.
Fun fact, You cannot introduce the chain of custody as your evidence. If a detective found a murder weapon at the scene and you keep a proper chain of custody, but the murder weapon goes missing, you cannot introduce the photos of the weapon or the reports about the weapon as evidence. The point of a chain of custody is to authenticate the evidence, not substitute for it. When studying ancient history, we must use the clues that we have to piece together what was most likely to have happened, as we rarely have direct evidence of the ancient past. Which is why studying ancient history is not like solving a cold case. If you want us to treat your evidence for the Gospels like evidence in a cold case, you don't have any. You have pieces of a chain of custody and no direct evidence. If you want us to treat the Gospels like any other ancient historic document, we can. But don't claim that they have the level of reliability of admissible evidence in a criminal case. They don't. Pick a lane. If you want me to treat your evidence like that in a criminal case, then produce admissible evidence. If you want me to treat the Gospels as ancient historical documents, then don't claim to have a chain of custody on them like a murder case when you clearly don't.
You can demonstrate for a jury that you can show every link in the chain and how it hasn't changed link to link. You've got good reason to believe that your evidence hasn't been tampered with.
And we clearly do not have that with the Gospels, as I have already demonstrated.
Well, is there a New Testament chain of custody? Yeah, as a matter of fact, there is. For example, John, he writes a gospel. Well, okay, but how do you know the Gospel of John you have in your Bible today is unaltered from the original Gospel of John?
Of course he doesn't pick Mark, because he knows he can't do this with Mark, as Mark was most definitely altered, and we can't know for sure which version of Mark was the original.
Well, who were the next officers in the chain of custody he gave it to? He gave it to 3 of his students, 3 personal students of John who sat at his feet and listened to everything that John said about Jesus. Ignatius, Polycarp, Papias. These students of John wrote down what John told them.
That is quite the claim there. Let's explore it. In order for Ignatius, Polycarp, and Papias to be in the chain of custody for authenticating the Gospel of John, first, the Apostle John would need to have been the author of that Gospel. This is unlikely, and the evidence of its unlikeliness comes from the very witnesses that our detective cites as authenticating it. According to Bart Ehrman, I think these are legends meant to buttress the credentials and therefore the authority of Polycarp and Papias. It is interesting and worth reflecting on that we have an actual letter from Polycarp in which he quotes from Matthew, Mark, and Luke, but not from John. Why would that be if John was his teacher and if John wrote the 4th Gospel? My view is that either John was not his teacher or he does not think that John wrote the Gospel. In some ways, Papias is even more interesting. If Papias was John's disciple and he talked about John as the author of the 4th Gospel, why does Eusebius, when quoting Papias, mention only what he says about Matthew and Mark? Why not give Papias comments on John? I would suppose that either it's because Papias does not say that John wrote the Gospel, or that he says someone else wrote it, or that he says yet something else about it that was not acceptable to Eusebius's views 200 years later. In any event, it is relatively clear why Christians at the end of the 2nd century would want to claim that John, the son of Zebedee, wrote the 4th Gospel. And it is equally clear why, in fact, he almost certainly did not. What is it that Mr. Wallace thinks these 3 alleged witnesses say about the Gospel of John that would authenticate it? We don't know, because he doesn't say. He merely makes the claim that they do and moves on, as if telling a judge that you have a chain of custody, but never producing that chain of custody would fly in a court of law.
Well, yeah, but how could we access? Well, it turns out you're lucky that you became local leaders in the church. Big leaders in the church, as a matter of fact, who wrote letters to local congregations. These letters still exist today. We can look at those letters to see what it is they're describing about Jesus, what it is that John told them about Jesus.
False. We have no original manuscripts of the works of Ignatius, Papias, or Polycarp. Some works attributed to Ignatius are known forgeries created in the Middle Ages. Some copies are considered genuine. When your chain of custody has breaks in it like this, it's no longer admissible in court. For Polycarp, the oldest manuscripts of his letters date to the 10th and 13th centuries. His works have been pieced together from various manuscripts and from the writings of Eusebius. For Papias, it's even worse. We not only don't have any original manuscripts, we don't even have any copies of his writings. All we have is what other writers say that he wrote. According to Bart Ehrman, Papias has emerged in modern scholarship as a very important figure because he indicated that he had personally interviewed people who were companions of those who were followers of Jesus' own disciples. So he's not an eyewitness who knew the disciples himself, let alone Jesus, but he does trace a direct lineage back to them. So much for Wallace's claim that Papias was a disciple of John the Apostle. What we have about him says that Papias said he was not. Wallace might know this and might be being a bit slippery with the evidence. Either that or he's being sloppy again. By his claim that we have the writings of these men, he might mean that we don't have the original manuscripts, but we do have copies that were made later. For two of them, we do. But that's like saying the murder weapon was next to the body and then showing the judge a picture of the room where the body was discovered, but neither the weapon nor the body are in the picture, and asking the judge to trust you that all of the evidence was there. The photographer was just facing the wrong way when he shot the picture.
There are 7 letters that exist still from Ignatius, 1 from Polycarp, written to local congregations. We could check them, right? We could look and see, is Jesus simpler in those letters? He's not divine, right? I mean, he wasn't born of a virgin. Did he rise from the grave? Are those elements there? Is all the divine nature of Jesus reported early by the people who were listening to John personally?
This doesn't answer the question that you claimed you were answering of whether the later Gospels embellished on a simpler Jesus in Mark's Gospel. All we know from the letters is that this was what Ignatius believed. Is anyone even questioning this point?
Elsa? Do you want to build a straw man?
Further, the question the video is supposed to be addressing is whether the book you have before you as the Bible is what was written by the original authors. If the original author of Mark wrote of a simpler Jesus than the original author of John is an entirely different question. No chain of custody is going to answer that question. Only a study of the text will. If you're trying to answer the question of whether the original text of John portrayed Jesus one way, and the text was changed over the years to later portray Jesus as being the divine miracle worker that we have in the text today, what would be the point of that? No one is making that argument, thus refuting this is pointless.
Elsa? Do you want to build a straw man?
If the whole purpose of this video is so you can make up a silly argument against your holy book and then destroy it, congratulations, I guess. But if the point is to try to convince your audience that they can trust their Bibles, you've given them nothing but smoke and mirrors. The sad part is a believing audience seeing this would likely think that Wallace had a point, which is exactly what you see in the comments to his video. I guess I have my work cut out for me. The audience missed Wallace's bait and switch. He baits the audience with the question of whether their Bibles are the original works of the authors, but when he cannot answer that question, he switches to whether the stories about Jesus changed over time.
Irenaeus is the student of Ignatius and Polycarp. You can look at his writing to see what he learned from his masters. He had a student, Hippolytus. Hippolytus is the student of Irenaeus. You could look at Hippolytus to see what Irenaeus taught. You follow my thinking here. We've got a chain of custody, and we could go officer to officer, teacher to student, then teacher to student, then teacher to student, to see if the story of Jesus is changing over time.
Except this is, again, not the question you claimed you were addressing. And even if it was, the changes came long before the lives of these alleged witnesses to the stories. Changes in the story from the time of Jesus until the time the stories were first written down, we have no way of documenting. Changes in the story from the first gospel to the last, we can, and we do definitely see changes. We most definitely see changes in how the story is interpreted. Take your own example of Papias. He wasn't well received by his contemporary church fathers because of his view of a millennial kingdom of Christ, that Jesus would return for a 1,000-year reign. Whether or not Revelation was even scripture was debated at that point, and the general position of the church was that there would be no such 1,000-year reign. The church believed that this was metaphorical. Whether or not creation occurred in 6 literal days was debated. The Gnostics, Marcions, and others considered heretics taught various ideas about who Jesus was that differed from the Orthodox views. There was no unity of the faith. The selling of indulgences and burning of witches are other doctrines that came and went. These are not changes in the Bible, but they are changes in interpretation. But you have shifted your point from changes in the Bible to changes in what people believe about Christianity. That has most definitely changed, even in my lifetime. Many churches now embrace the LGBTQ community, an idea that was unheard of 50 years ago.
Do you realize by the time we get to Irenaeus, Irenaeus is actually listing 24 of the books of the New Testament that he is using with his student Hippolytus? Don't let anyone tell you that the Gospels were cobbled together and the New Testament books were cobbled together at some council in the early church in the 4th century.
Do you wanna build a straw man?
No, in fact, they were being quoted immediately by the first students of the eyewitnesses. They were being listed hundreds of years before the church councils. The councils don't create the canon. They simply confirm the canon that's already in use, already being quoted in the chain of custody.
If this were true, there would not have been so much discussion on whether or not James, Hebrews, or Revelation should be included or not. There would have been no question about the Apocrypha either, which even today the Catholic Church accepts, but the Protestant Church does not. Again, you have changed the question. I'm not sure what question you are even addressing anymore, but certainly it isn't the one that you claimed you were addressing at the outset.
But how do I know that the account I have in my Bible today wasn't changed from the point at which it was written?
I don't know of anyone who thinks the church councils made up the Bible when they decided on the canon, or rewrote it, as you imply. It sure is easier to show up those unbelievers when you make up those straw man arguments for yourself, isn't it?
I've given in Cold Case Christianity 3 different chains of custody from John, from Paul, from Peter, in 3 entirely different regions of the empire, in Rome, in Asia Minor, in North Africa. Amazingly, the chain of custody shows the same thing over and over and over again. If you lost every canonical book we have today, every book of the Bible was lost, and all you had were the documents written by the first links in the chain right after the eyewitnesses. The story of Jesus was told early in history, repeated often, and it never changes. It stays the same over time.
Again, demonstrably untrue. You forget that what you have in your Bible isn't all that was written about Jesus. Did you know that the Talmud says this? On the eve of the Sabbath, which happened also to be the eve of the Passover, Jesus the Nazarene was hanged. A herald had already gone forth before him 40 days, declaring Jesus the Nazarene is going to be stoned because he practiced sorcery and instigated and seduced Israel to idolatry. Whoever knows anything in his defense may come and state it. Except the Talmud says that this happened in 75 BCE, nearly a century before your Jesus was born. That the stories of Jesus that your church fathers chose as canon all agree on some of the facts that they believe about Jesus is hardly surprising. That they use that book to shape their theology and doctrine is what one would expect a religious group to do. That there is plenty more out there that tells an entirely different story about Jesus is also fact. That Paul had to write to correct theology in the church, and Ignatius wrote against heresies, further attests that there was no unity of the faith in the early church. On the contrary, the whole purpose of choosing the canon was to set official church doctrine and policy.
Now, I want to return for a second to something we talked about earlier in one of the earlier sessions. This claim made by skeptics, including Bart Ehrman, that says, hey, you can't trust what the Gospels say because he found variations, single word usually, variations between the most ancient documents. Let's just do a little thought experiment for a second on that issue.
Oh, we seem to have returned to the original topic. What was all that other stuff that was off point about? It's cute how you try to minimize the inconsistencies in the manuscripts by claiming that many of them are just the difference of a letter. And that is true. But the problem is, there aren't just thousands of differences. There are hundreds of thousands of them.
Even if it is breached, it would take a number beyond reckoning, thousands, to storm the keep.
Tens of thousands.
But, my lord, there is no such force.
And yes, many of them are inconsequential, but many are not. For example, let's go with the Gospel of John. The story of the woman caught in adultery is found only in this Gospel, and most New Testament scholars today say that this was not in the original text. It isn't in some of the older manuscripts. Same with the story of the woman at the well in John 4. These are not a difference of a mere letter, and your early witnesses are silent on these disputed passages.
To determine if we can know the reliability of the Bible is actually certain. Imagine if I removed every line of Scripture in which you found a variant. It wouldn't be every line. It would be just every so often. What if I was to grant you that I will allow you to, for sake of argument only, to remove not only the variant, take the word out, but take out the entire line in which the variant existed? No, do better than that. Let's take out every other verse. Pick the even or the odd. We'll just take it out and take a look at what we have left. Do you think by taking out every other verse, and no skeptic thinks that it's this bad, that every other verse needs to be removed and can't be trusted, but even if you thought it was and you took it out, would you actually lose the narrative? Would you actually lose the truth claims of Christianity by taking out every other verse? Actually, you wouldn't.
It doesn't matter, because the question isn't, can you still put the story together and get the same story? The question is it reliable as the Word of God? If this really is the holy word of an infallible God, then this word should be infallible. If it isn't, you can't truthfully claim that your God wants you to do or to be or to think or to believe anything in particular, as the word that this God left you is so full of untruths that working the truths from the untruths becomes a daunting task suitable only to the Bible scholar. If a layperson can't read the Bible and know from a plain reading of the text whether the passage they are reading was part of the original text or not, they can't know if they are reading God's word or man's.
And here's why I say that. If you took out every other verse of the Gospels, take out some verses from John, take out verses from Luke and Mark and Matthew, well, whatever you took out of Luke, there's a good chance the parallel account in Mark or Matthew would reinsert the data that you just took out of Luke. These Gospels describe the same events. So there's a good chance whatever you take out of one Gospel, it's going to come right back as reliable from the other Gospel.
Since portions of Matthew and Luke are copied verbatim from Mark, this is true. It's also how you know these are not eyewitness accounts, and how we know the Gospel that bears Mark's name was written first. But there are some portions that are unique to each. The question should not be, can you put the story together from the pieces, but rather, is the story true? Did it happen? If it did, is the story that we have today the same as what happened, or did it change in the process? Is what we have just historical fiction? That we cannot know. As demonstrated, there are changes to the text made by various scribes over the centuries. In addition to those changes, were there embellishments to the story made in the oral stages before the stories were ever written down? This is very likely. The gospel that bears Matthew's name tells us of hundreds of zombies walking around Jerusalem on Resurrection Day, and the temple veil to the Holy of Holies splitting in two. These appear in no other gospel. Some modern apologists reject these as historical, as there is no corroborating evidence for them, and such monumental events should at least be mentioned by a secular historian or two if they really happened. Wallace would likely tell us that it doesn't matter if it happened or not. We still have the gist of the story that there was a resurrection day. I don't doubt that the authors thought that it happened, but the authors thinking it happened doesn't add up to it really happening. There are no secular sources that corroborate such an event. If this really were the greatest event in human history, as believers claim, one would think that at least one unbeliever would write of the historical portion. Instead, all we get from secular sources is Jesus was crucified and died. That's it. No more.
Miss Clavel turned out the light and closed the door. And that's all there is. There isn't any more.
So much of the narrative you're going to get back anyway. And then, if you took the early church fathers we just talked about, those early people in the chain of custody, and what they wrote about what they had learned from the eyewitnesses, and you just put that data back into the Gospels, you're never going to get rid of the story of Jesus.
Not all of it, but you will for some of it, like the long ending of Mark and the woman caught in adultery. These were changed. Does that matter to you, Mr. Wallace?
You could take out half of the entire New Testament, and you'd still have more than enough reason to believe the claims of the Gospels, because they're either going to be found back in again from the other accounts, the parallel accounts, or you've got enough data still in the account to know that it's true.
You really don't. Knowing 4 people who were believers wrote stories about Jesus doesn't make the stories true any more than the fact that multiple people wrote stories about Robin Hood makes the Robin Hood tales true. There may have been a person that these stories started from. There are historical figures and real places in these stories, but none of that makes the stories themselves true.
So this whole idea that somehow identifying variants between manuscripts should cast doubt on what they say seems ridiculous, especially if I'm willing to grant you that you could take out every other verse and that won't even get rid of the Jesus story.
So you claim, but have you tried it? Does it even work? It's a monumental task to put together, and I won't bother, since
that which is asserted without evidence can be dismissed without evidence.
You've got good reason to believe that the Jesus story has been recorded reliably, so you know enough to make a decision about the truth. And now we've taken a look at 3 aspects of reliability. Is it early enough? Can it be corroborated? And has it been transmitted to us over time reliably? Has the story changed? It hasn't.
the only evidence you presented in support of your claim was that early church fathers quote from the Gospels, therefore they didn't change. But do they quote from the entire books? No. Can they attest to the whole story? No. Do they even attest to the book that you claim that they authenticate? Again, no. Your 3 alleged witnesses in your chain of custody don't even quote from John, the material that they are allegedly authenticating. Their original work is lost to us. All we have is copies from centuries later that may or may not themselves have been altered. You can't present an incomplete chain of custody in lieu of evidence in trial. Your Bible demonstrably was changed as it was copied. Thousands of these changes are inconsequential, but they are changes nonetheless. Some of the changes are monumental. The important question is whether or not this is the word of your God. If it is, your God is either so sloppy at preserving it that he's allowed these changes to occur, he doesn't care as it isn't important to him, or he doesn't exist, and this is just a man-made book about a man-made God, just like all the other religions out there. Live your life.